Let's see if we have a.
Joe, when I had you out here in Australia, we visited a fish farmer who really opened our eyes to how quickly fishes that fall to the bottom, because some of them will do that rather than just float, what happens to them in their experience, how long can they actually last?
Yeah.
And Glenn, I'll ask you in advance just one question. Did you find many bits of fossil poo with the fish?
Oh, all over the place. I'm looking to see if these had it. We had several with the fossil poo. Yes.
Good.
And we kept
Okay.
some that have the fish with the poo as well.
Yeah, very, very unconstipated fish. Joe, fill us in on what we learned that visit to the fish breeder.
Yeah. So you've got the standard argument, which is that these fish have lived and died and sunk to the bottom of the sea or the lake or whatever, and have slowly been buried. Right. We've got the graphic from the Natural History Museum in the UK, as well as the Colchester Natural History Museum, which basically has these fish dying and sinking to the bottom. And that becomes a problem when you realise that the majority of fish don't sink to the bottom. They'll bloat and they'll float. If you've watched Crocodile Dundee, you know he set a bomb off under the water and they all floated to the top, right? But you also find that there are certain conditions in which these fish do sink to the bottom, whether if they don't have, if they don't have swim bladders like some sharks, or if they're in very cold water conditions where they sink to the bottom, right? Which doesn't match what the Green River Formation is, by the way. It certainly seems tropical there. But anyway, even if you do have fish sink to the bottom, you still have a problem because you still have bacteria and fungus that lives on the bottom, specifically good at decomposing tough things, right? Like silica-based seaweed or fish keratin scales. And you'll find that they'll catch hold of the fish. Some of them will even anchor the fish to the bottom of the seabed, so they've got no chance of floating up, but they'll actually, within just a few hours, begin to decay and decompose and destroy the fish at the bottom of the tanks or the bottom of the sea or river or lake bed or whatever. So you still have a problem of decomposition. Even if you have fish that sink to the bottom, you've still got to get them buried deep enough
Yes.
to be able to not only preserve them, stop them rotting away, but they have to be deep enough to stop things from burrowing down to them, to stop things from burrowing up to them, to stop water from washing them away. And you've still got a problem with funguses and bacteria actually decomposing and destroying them. So you're clearly dealing with something which is far, far more rapid and far more catastrophic than your standard fall to the bottom of the sea and slowly be built up. Right? Especially when you then find things with, buried next to plants and so on and so on and so forth. In fact, I think it was on the Blue Planet, the BBC David Attenborough documentary, where they found whale death, which is basically an enormous whale, right, that has died, and eventually, normally when whales die, they bloat and float, and then eventually they explode. You can read the old sailors' records of the exploding whales, right? But once they have exploded and they become waterlogged, they sink down and they reach the bottom of the sea. And they found one of these, and you just saw that it was absolutely teeming with life. Right, everything from hagfish to crabs to lobsters on there, eating it away. And they visited it, I think it was 6 months or a year later, but they visited a fairly short period of time later, and there was nothing left but a few scraps of bones, which would very soon disappear. So nothing left within, I believe it was less than a year, if my memory serves me correct, to actually destroy an entire whale. Now, think how much less time it takes to destroy a small fish. So you're definitely dealing with something which is far more rapid and far more deeper than what we would observe under normal circumstances. But John, this is really the result of Lyellian thinking in terms of present being the key to the past, because Lyell was not just pro-uniformitarianism, he was also anti-catastrophist in all forms of the sense.
Yeah, he certainly was. In fact, being a lawyer, he was far better with words and grammar than most people give him credit for. He knew what he was out to achieve. And number one, he was out to destroy confidence in Noah's flood and catastrophic geology. Now, he did it by just absolutely annihilating in people's minds any sort of catastrophe at all. so that we now get to a world where, when I did geology, the professor began by saying, we are not going to discuss any such catastrophic rubbish. Now, I didn't come from a church family background, so I wondered, what on earth is this all about? And then I discovered the real aim was aimed at Noah's flood being catastrophic. But what you did was demolish any catastrophism, so that when I started geology, they didn't even have local catastrophes on their schedule. Now, they backtracked a bit from that because it's so obvious that many things like Mount St. Helens and that form rapid beds, they deposit quickly, they are catastrophic. So they've been pushed back a little bit. Praise God for that. But be careful you don't fall into Lyell's other trap. He wants you to demolish all catastrophism. In his aim is to get you to think, well, if all catastrophism is out, then Noah's flood is out. But in reality, there'll be big catastrophes, there'll be little catastrophes. So use great wisdom. Now, Joe, just to ask you a question, I'm sure you've kept fish, and I noticed that Anne has kept fish there too. I have kept fish in tanks. We've done this for years. And the one thing I noticed about their poo, and sorry to bring back to poo, Glenn, but you find plenty of it. I've got heaps of specimens from yeah, great stuff. Look at it. Look at it. It's all over the place. And the reality, when you keep an aquarium, it's almost as if this is a living food supply for the fish that's waiting there behind the other fish just to swallow up the poo, almost like, rotating probiotics. That's what it is. And when you live in the real world and you go scuba diving, whatever, I'm sure, Glenn, you've done a lot of scuba diving. The one thing you don't find is piles of fish poo on the floor, correct?
Well, I was scuba diving yesterday in a freshwater lake, and that was one of the things I was really looking for. I got all excited because I thought I found it, and I picked it up, and it was decomposing rubber worm. So,
okay. Now, since you mentioned what it was decomposing, the other thing that I notice about deposits like the Green River is the absolute anomalies that are there. You have herrings with palm trees. You have herrings with all sorts of sticks. In fact, if you actually do what you're supposed to do and add up the life that's there, the biotics, add up the plant material that's there, it is an absolute anomaly. The plants and the fishes do not match one another, right? Whether you're thinking of a desert environment like the middle of Australia with the Murray River, or whether you're thinking of a tropical environment, the absolute match is just not there. So this is not a buried environment. Joe, you'd agree with that necessity of that analysis?
Yeah, very much so. And you can see this in, the examples that Glenn has got, some of the examples in our museums around the world. I mean, you've got some spectacular fossils, John, from the Green River Formation, vomiting fish and all sorts. We've got one of these regurgitating fish, which we're pretty sure is regurgitating rather than being swallowed, because you can even see all of the mouth marks right down the back of the fish where it's been squashed and forced out. And that's the other thing. These fishes are squashed. Right, they're flattened. They're still 3D because they've still got all the individual 3D bones in them, but they're squashed, they're flattened, and have had a huge amount of force that has forced this stuff out of their mouths.
yes.
Yeah, so therefore, when you look at these catastrophic deposits, be careful. Mega catastrophics, minor catastrophics. Don't fall for Lyell's trap of saying all catastrophism's out, or don't fall for the other one of making fun of you because you said something is a major worldwide catastrophe when you can actually map the edge of it. Now, Joe, you and I have done a lot of work on Jurassic and Cretaceous and all of that. And you remember the green layer that's underneath some of those that goes all over the globe?
Yeah, so you can find, when it comes to Cretaceous, so remember Cretaceous means chalk. It's the Latin chalk rock, right? Now, where can you trace the Cretaceous deposits? Particularly, let's go specific, right? Where can you trace the chalk deposits? Well, as John just mentioned, you have the greenstone or the green sand formation, which comes in two forms, which is your green sand or your cast stone, right? It's basically the same layer of sandstone. Now, bear in mind as a side point, when you're dealing with sandstone, you're dealing with a size of grain, which means you need 3 times the amount of original material to erode away in order just to produce your sand, right? So you need a huge amount of water deposit, or water erosion rather, not just to get, deposit your sand, but get your sand in the first place. Okay, so where do we trace the chalk? Well, again, John has traced this, I've traced this, but we can also go to Professor Deregager, who traced it as well, right? Because he said the chalk extends in essentially the same form from the Texas, Austin chalk in Texas, all the way across to the Donetsk coal region, right? Well, Donetsk has been in the news a lot. It's in modern day Ukraine, right? In formerly USSR at the time that Deregager did the work. So you've got something which not only is provably same deposit of rock, because it all sits on the same bed of sandstone, but you've actually got something which doesn't cover a few states. It covers a huge volume of continental, boundaries as well. It goes across continents. Now, what's even more amazing is that Professor Deregager thought that he'd mapped out all the chalk, right, from going from Texas to the Donetsk coal basin, but it turns out that it's turned up in even other further places, including over on the west coast of Australia. So you find that this is now all of a sudden a global deposit on an enormous scale, right? And if you think, 600 feet is thick, you'll find that some of the thickest chalk deposits in the world are over 1,000 feet thick, right? In places like Norfolk, where you can go right the way down, you're talking mind-bogglingly enormous scale. And the other one that's worth pointing out, John, because you can do this as well with the Jurassic and the Ordovician and so on and so forth. But the other one that Professor Deregager pointed out was about the Carboniferous, Pennsylvanian/Mississippian, if you're in the States, which you can not only trace across the entirety of continental North America, right, but you can also find it in the same form throughout the rest of the world, Europe, Asia, down on the west coast of Australia, and in fact it's some sort of, I think it is 170 degrees of latitude. That was the quote that Professor Deregager used. It's certainly much more than that. So now that we found it in Australia, so you're dealing with something which is on a far greater scale than even countrywide or continent-wide. You're dealing with something that is intercontinental.
Just one more question, Dan. You dug up heaps of fossils, brought them home. Well done. Museum in the USA will be progressively going on. But having had a look at some of the ones you've been working on, did you notice whether you had any fish that were polystrate to the strata, or were they all flattened? Flattened into the strata?
They're all flattened into the strata that we found, but there are some that are different thicknesses, certainly. One very large one, very thick.
But the one thing I'll guarantee you didn't find is a fish standing at right angles to the strata.
That's exactly right.
Right, so they're all pushed over. So one of the evidences that this has been a current washing in, bringing anomalous plants like palm trees and fruit and sticks, as well as the fishes, everything has come in sideways. And then as it's been deposited, everything has been squashed, whether it's the fish, whether it's the branches or whatever. So it's definitely a regional catastrophe on an impressive scale, but it's not a community that's been buried. Did you catch what I just said? And Joe, you might want to comment on that, where you've been. Not a community that's been buried. It's from a wide area that's washed in and suddenly buried in massive laminations. I regret, Glenn, because I sent you an email saying, make sure you get to the 18-inch layer, and you didn't. What happened?
So one of the interesting things about our trip is we pressed on through all the adversity. And let me tell you, just like on this event, every event, we would go do what we had scheduled to do. We had that place reserved from 8 till 12. At 12 o'clock, we finished, and it started raining. And by 12:30, it was lightning. And we got back to our hotel room. It was hailing. So obviously, God didn't want me to do the one that was going to be the 18-inch layer, because we went, met up with him, and sat in his shop talking for 2 hours while we watched lightning striking all around us and hail coming down. And he said, I don't think we're going to be able to do this. He said, come back tomorrow night. So we went on to Yellowstone, spent the day at Yellowstone, came back that night. Same thing. So obviously God didn't want us to do that, because every event that we did, even going to Yellowstone, we did the entire thing at Yellowstone. As soon as we got back out, man, down comes the rain and lightning. And you know what happens out west when you get at least little rain, you've got flash floods. That's
Well, we're glad you made it back safely and used your common sense there.
Yes. So we didn't get to the 18-inch, but I learned a lot in talking with the person that that preps fossils for museums and runs that other quarry for the 18-inch layer. Well, I was going to add, John, you brought up a good point, because I've been in the Atchafalaya Basin at a massive fish kill. It was after a hurricane, and I went in with my father-in-law to retrieve his hoop nets. And the wildlife and fisheries people of the state of Louisiana said it was a complete fish kill, that it was a total kill. And it was because of all the organic matter that was pushed down, and all the trees and leaves in the water decomposing just removed all the dissolved oxygen from the water to where it was a massive fish kill. Well, what did the fish do? They bloated, they floated, they formed debris piles, and they were just piled up in every kind of configuration. And that's not what we would see here. We did find a tremendous amount of fish, and you saw the plate where there were 6 of them, but in a bloating debris pile, they would be all over the place in every configuration. So you got to have a mass mortality event that quickly buries them, and it's clearly in a flowing water type scenario.
Yeah. Very good.
Yeah, well, I'd just like to add something as someone who's bred tens of thousands of fish. So we've bred up to 100,000 fish a year, and I've seen a lot of fish death, I can tell you. But I just throw a curly one in there. They don't rarely in a fish farm. The initial thing they do is actually sink to the bottom when they die. So you generally find them dead on the bottom, but because we're in a farm, we've got to get rid of them quickly. So we take them out generally as soon as we find them, which would be less than a day. But the bulk of fish, when they die and fall and go to the bottom. It's probably something later that happens with the bloating. Maybe if it happens straight away, it's because of what they're eating or whatever is going on inside their guts might cause them to float. But I mean, we've all seen the pictures of mass fish deaths out in the ocean and so on, where they're all floating and being washed up on the beach. But it's not always the case that's what happens straight away. They can actually sink. And so you could have a death by some sort of chemical imbalance in the water, for example, that they die, they go to the bottom. And then if you've got a big layer of sediment come over, they'll come straight over the top. So I don't think we should.
Yeah, that's the key. It's got to be very quickly. Yeah.
It's not always just a single process is what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why that fish farmer's observation that he either had to rescue his dead fish to save the other ones, or he noticed a fungus would come and do it for him. So there are ways of cleaning these up, but you can always tell a bundle of fish that's just been covered up because you'll get polystrate fish in it, not just flattened fish. So you see this in some of the Scottish deposits. Have you seen the Scottish lungfish beds, Joe?
Oh yeah. No, I've gone up and dug there, and you find that you've also got it where it's been trapped so quickly that you've got almost like an iridescence, like an oily iridescence on it, which is effectively biochemicals. It's soft tissue, it's living matter that's trapped in there, or fresh soft squidgy stuff that's trapped in there. So you're definitely dealing with a very, very fast and rapid deposit of these fish. It's the old sandstone deposits up there, isn't it? The old red sandstone deposits.
Yes. I've got some lovely lungfish fossils from up there, and even further north in that beautiful fish bed halfway up Scotland that's sort of semi off limits now to many people.